Okay, so we are going to have a bit of a panel now to discuss some of the things that have been brought up through Maria's excellent presentation. Thank you for that. That was super cool to see it in action. I know I've been reading lots about it for a long time, but watching it happen is just amazing. And we also have a couple of other folks who are going to join us today. We have Jess and we have Adele, who should be here. Yeah, hello, hi folks. So what we're going to do in this panel today is discuss a bit more about the project that you did this work for, how that was developed, and also a bit about how the games community can get involved with technologies that can often assist people to access different parts of tech that they haven't before, or can interact with it in different ways they haven't before, and how we can build these things in a way that's meaningful to people as well. So I would like to hand over to Jess and Adele to introduce yourselves and your work, if you don't mind. Jess, would you mind kicking off, please?
Sure thing. Hi, my name is Dr Korte, and I am the lead researcher and lead designer of the Auslan Communication Technologies Pipeline Project, which is the fancy academic name for it. My background is in participatory design, but from a research perspective, I tend to refer to this project as human-centered AI, because it's often, a pipeline of artificial intelligence technologies that traditionally don't always involve working with end users to figure out how that artificial intelligence should work. So it's really important to me that we've been working with the deaf community, the people who will be using this technology, to actually make a good product that they're going to want to use, and not just, hey, we made a thing, go figure it out if you can use it or not.
Thanks, Jess. And Adele, thanks very much for being on the panel. Could you please give a brief background of who you are, how you're involved with the project?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Adele Vogel. I identify as a coder and hard of hearing. CODA is an acronym for Child of Deaf Adults. So both my parents are profoundly deaf, and Auslan is my first language, hence my involvement in the project as an Auslan expert. And my background's in philosophy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, folks. Okay, so what we're intending to do for the next half hour is have a bit of a discussion, bounce off each other, dig into some of the issues, and also hopefully address some of the questions that may be coming up in chat as well. So if you do have questions during the panel, we will do our best to try and incorporate those as best we can here. One thing I wanted to start with is something that you touched on in your introduction, Jess, which is about the creation of these types of technologies and how oftentimes people might think that an assistive technology might be a really cool idea. And they start to jump into the development of these. I've seen things like gloves that are used to take, I think American Sign Language is like input. But what happens is that a lot of these are often built without any consultation with the communities that they're trying to serve. When we were discussing this, I think last week, you had a great term for this, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I wondered if you could talk a bit about that as it intersects with your work.
Yes, absolutely. So the term that I mentioned last week is disability dongle. And this was coined by, I'm going blank on the name, Elise Jackson, I think is the name, but I can find that out in just a sec, who is herself a disability advocate. Nope, sorry, my database is not cooperating with me today. But this was based on a tweet that she sent out several years ago in response to technologies like gloves that don't fully understand sign language and are just looking at usually letter hand shapes, which is not the full richness of the language. Or it might have been a wheelchair that's been designed to run up a particular set of stairs, which members of each relevant disability community are quick to say, we don't actually want this. We want technologies that will actually meet our needs, not the needs that people outside of the community perceive us as having without any justification.
Sure. And so for this work that you're doing at the moment, I realize that's sort of forefront of your mind. When you were sort of architecting this project, how did you set out to ensure that your work doesn't fall into that category?
So there's a few different ways that you can do it. I personally think the best approach to any technology design project is to work with your end users. And there's different ways you can do that and different levels of involvement, which might be appropriate depending on what your technology is, what your approach is, what your community is. But, like I said, my background's participatory design research. The participatory is the important bit there.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And my next question is for you, Adele, which is, firstly, have you had much experience being a member of the community as with people interacting with technologies that have been developed without any particular consideration of the needs of the community in mind? And what was your feeling about this particular project, and how do you feel having been involved with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think obviously I can't speak for the whole community, but I think the general feeling and consensus when it comes to disability dongles is often they're developed, say for example, the ASL gloves. They're developed so that hearing people can understand deaf people. It's a lot of these disability dongles are developed so that people with disability can fit in to the mainstream world, rather than people without who are able-bodied trying to fit in with their world, you know? And I think the huge difference with this project is that the community has been involved from the beginning. Their voices and perspective is really heard, their concerns are addressed, and I think that's the huge difference. A lot of people in the community are really excited about this project that I speak to. And I think it's the first time I've heard or seen genuine excitement about advancing tech. So it's really beautiful.
Awesome. Maria, what did you learn about this type of tech through your work on the project?
Oh, for me, this project was completely mind-opening and mind-blowing because this is the world I've never, I didn't know much about before I joined the project. And I started learning Auslan just a little bit, and I thought it was very good. Creative challenge for me, but I also really enjoyed creating with the deaf community, because also part of my research is also about community engagement and co-design when creating interactive characters. And I especially loved this one moment we had during the co-design workshop, where I realized the participants of the workshop, they kept saying our avatar, and I just thought, oh, it's so great, because they felt the ownership, and which was absolutely the truth of it, because we designed it together. We kept brainstorming, and they raised some questions and concerns that I never even considered. And just, simple things like, the colors, or, the hair, because I would normally, as someone from, as a designer, as an animator, I would just want to push the technology as far as I could, just to make it look cool. But they would like, oh, that hair, dynamic hair is actually a bit distracting, and things like that. So I thought it was a very good experience for me, and also made me really interested and invested in co-design.
Brilliant. Jess, for you as a researcher in this field, you have clearly already seen the potential of games-related technologies for this kind of thing. This project exists and is making good use of them. What kinds of other things are you keen to explore? Are you keen to see other people explore that involve games-related technologies, and how do you think that they can help people?
So I'm particularly interested in, as well as the stuff we're doing here, obviously, virtual and augmented realities. I had an honours student earlier this year who finished up, who worked with me on using virtual reality to enable some of our deaf participants to interact with a virtual reality apartment with embedded Alexas that understood signing, by which we meant we had an interpreter in the room, who I believe was Adele for all of the sessions. So the deaf folks would have the headset on, walk up to the device, sign a command, Adele would interpret, and the student would be able to press a button on the keyboard that would trigger, turning the lights on or off or whatever the command was. So that's been a really interesting experience. Augmented reality also has a lot of potential, particularly around the fact that for young deaf children, something like 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, which means they're not born into an environment where a language that's easily accessible to them is commonly being used, which means that if we have opportunities to put things into the home, like augmented reality anchors that you can come along with your smartphone, an iPad, whatever it is, scan the QR code, scan the anchor, and up pops an augmented reality, either avatar or video, that says, you've just signed the fruit bowl. Here's the sign for fruit bowl and a couple of, common fruits. Then that's going to help increase the children and the parents' vocabulary in a very natural, embedded in reality way.
Adele, as someone who has spent, started their life using Auslan as a first language and is also able to use other technologies that are intended for hearing people, what do you see as the main gaps that might have good applications for further development in the use of these technologies, of just technologies generally? Where do they fall down?
I think that technologies fall down because they're made for the majority, not made for minorities. And a really good example of that is at home, we have a Google Home. And obviously my English is perfectly fine. It's you can understand it, whatever. But I actually have to ask my partner to interpret what I'm saying to speak to the Google Home because it doesn't understand English in the way that I structure it, because I've got that other language sort of influencing the way that I speak. So I think, technology needs to be developed with all these different variations in mind. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I'm also really interested to know a bit about the structure of Auslan grammars as opposed to spoken English, spoken Australian English.
Yeah, that's a good question. Jess is actually better at explaining the actual way the sentence is structured. But from my understanding, you kind of say I think it's the subject of the sentence first. So instead of saying I'm going to the shops, you'd say shops, I'm going. So I think it's more similar to a lot of foreign languages, if that, makes sense.
Yeah, makes total sense. Is there anything, Jess, that you wanted to elaborate on that point?
Adele's basically hit all the main points. I was just queuing up in my head. Well, linguists tend to refer to it as topic comment. And I have seen a comparison, I think, to Spanish, which has, I say, not knowing anything about Spanish, this is just what I've seen in a couple of the linguistic papers of saying that Spanish also does here is the topic or the context which we're discussing before making the comment about it.
Yep. Brilliant.
If I can add something I discovered during the co-design workshop and during this project is that there are different ways sign language is used, and that the deaf participants, they explain that there is a way a hearing person signs, and then there is a way a deaf person signs, and they. During the workshop, we did a bit of role playing, and they showed an example, like how deaf folks they talk to each other, and it's also always very like animated. They use lots of facial expressions. It's very interesting. It's always even though almost like it incorporates some role playing in the conversation. And then there is a kind of more formal way to sign. And when we talked about, discussed the avatar and how it should be animated, we discussed this sort of difference where they thought it would be appropriate for the avatar to sign like a hearing person signs, just like sort of in a normal way, for example, making an announcement. But in other times, for example, when you ask Alexa or Siri to make a joke, same thing could happen with a signing avatar. You can ask it to make a joke, or if you can, build in some silly things into it. And in this particular case, they would expect the avatar to act like a deaf person, to be more animated, to use those facial expressions, which is why we're so lucky now, because we have the technology to create this really expressive avatars that can actually do that. And we can we recorded several versions of the same sort of message that would be a bit more formal or like differently structured. And also we actually had to record several versions for different dialects of Auslan, which is also something I didn't realize, because Jess can talk about that probably.
Sure. So within Australia, there are two formal dialects of Auslan, which get referred to as Northern, which is the Queensland, New South Wales version, and Southern, which is everywhere else, which means that Northern and Southern may not necessarily be the best names, but have historical meaning based on the fact that there was a school for the deaf in Sydney and a school for the deaf in Melbourne. And this is where the two variants have spread from. But what we've also seen is, as deaf communities have come together, been using language, there's been language change, as there is any time communities group together and have that little bit of separation. So what we actually find is everywhere there's a major centre of the Australian deaf population, there's going to be variants and going to be differences in the vocabulary. So even though nominally New South Wales and Queensland both use the same dialect, we see even between Cairns and Brisbane differences in signing patterns.
Can anyone give an example of a difference between a so-called Northern and Southern dialect of Auslan?
We'll hand that one to Adele.
Yeah, I think a really funny one is this in a Northern dialect is coffee, but the exact same sign in a Southern dialect is car.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that could be an easily confused one. Especially if you're really tired and you're from Queensland and you're visiting Melbourne, you're like, oh God, caffeine, please. And they take you somewhere. Yeah, cool. Maria, I had a question for you, which was about the way you see this kind of particularly Auslan interpretive input as a thing that could be incorporated into games. You know, as someone with a technical background who understands how programming input works, clearly there's an additional step here that's required in terms of taking visual input as your marker in a lot of cases. What are your thoughts on how that might be incorporated into other environments in the future?
Well, I think that even though obviously I'm not a developer or AI specialist, I don't work on the sign recognition system. But in terms of my knowledge of motion capture, I know that the markerless systems that just analyze video and track the pose estimation and track movements just from video footage, they're becoming more advanced, they're becoming more popular. And that means that you can certainly use a webcam and in a game, for example, access the web camera and have the users, the gamer, sign, and that could be part of a game. And it's not necessarily not necessarily needs to be a game for a deaf person, but it can be a game that incorporates sign language in some way or signs. So I think it's actually a pretty cool tech, and it would be interesting to explore it. But also we have the VR headsets that have really good hand tracking now, and I know that there is now a bit of a community in VR that use the new Quest to communicate with each other, actually using sign language, which is amazing. So I think that just gesture recognition in general, it's very good, especially if you combine that with facial tracking, and so you can do all sorts of things with it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm really excited to hear that about the Quest 2 as someone who has a Quest and uses it, mostly to play Beat Saber, I'm going to be honest.
Same.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. I didn't know that that was the use of it. That's fantastic. You mentioned a lot, and this is a question for the room at large. You spoke just then, Maria, about the way that you use gesture tracking and facial tracking and so on for these kinds of things. And I know that for the purposes of this research, that's been in a fairly controlled environment. But when you're talking about an assistant, that's often something that's embedded in somebody's home and in a personal space. And I wondered what kinds of trade-offs you need to make in terms of privacy for these kinds of things if you are doing video capturing and analysis of sentiment and so on. We see a lot of that kind of stuff being used in public spaces all the time, mostly for advertising, sometimes for law enforcement purposes, and there is a lot of community sentiment that's fairly negative around that. So I would like to know a bit more about what kinds of privacy considerations need to be made, and perhaps we could also use this to dig into a broader discussion of the kinds of privacy trade-offs that disabled people often need to make in order to integrate with with technologies that have been built for able-bodied people. Perhaps, Jess, would you mind picking that one up just to start?
Sure. So obviously, privacy and security are two of the major issues that the folks we've been working with have brought up. Because, of course, if we're using the comparison to a Google Home or an Amazon Alexa, that's a microphone in your house that's always on. In order to capture signing, that's a camera in your home that's always on, which is a problem, especially in certain locations like, say, your bedroom, where you really don't want the camera catching you naked or involved in intimate activities, as we might call them. So obviously, one of the concerns that our participants have raised is, how do I control what it sees? How do I control, once it's seen something, where does that information get processed and stored and sent? And can anyone actually access that information? So basically the two leading approaches for, say, waking up the device, so this is the Hey Alexa parallel, have been, I want it always on and I can wave and it has a unique name sign and it only responds when it recognizes its unique name sign. Or the it's off until I press a button. And that tends to come down to how much is the privacy and the camera being always on a concern. But even the folks who are like, I want to wave and it has a name sign, also want to be able to turn it on and off, so that they can control what it's seeing and when. Cybersecurity has also been a concern of the fact that you're having a device that's potentially holding sensitive information, like credit card details, for example. It's really useful for your device to know what your credit card is so you can say things like, order the shopping list, but you don't want that to be accessible by anyone getting information out of the device. You also don't necessarily want anyone who wanders into your house being able to say, buy 3 kilograms of chocolate. And that would be the sort of thing where the folks we've been working with have asked us to look at things like facial recognition within the device so that we know who is trying to use the device. Does this person, is this a parent in the family who has the right to order the groceries? Is this a kid in the household who can do a lot of things around the house but perhaps can't access the money? Or is this a stranger who might be allowed to say, turn the TV or the music system on and off, but should not know that the device has a credit card embedded, practically speaking? Was there an extra part to the question, or have I hit most of the bits?
You've hit a lot of it. I'm also keen to hear takes from Adele and from Maria as well on this. Either of you feel free to jump in if you've got any other thoughts about this, how it relates to privacy and security.
Well, I can add, I guess, because my interest is in motion capture, I'm particularly interested in the facial tracking part, what Jess said, about recognizing the owner. because this is something that was definitely discussed several times during the workshop and the interviews. And I think that it's an interesting technical challenge, but also a very useful one, and something that not only deaf users might be interested in. And we also discussed the mobile application, potential mobile application, and where you would use it, because if you take a phone with you and start signing into the camera somewhere on the street, who would see you, what kind of things can you sign? So I think it's a very interesting, it's almost really a new research is required just to address these concerns.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
go on, sorry.
Point, I think, sorry, because a lot of our participants have said that they would really love a device that they can take with them around. Like, I think a few have even said, oh, I'd love to be able to take something with me traveling. And, someone could speak into the device and it could sign to me. So it's not even privacy considerations, I think, nationally, but internationally, if they want to take this device overseas, how does that work, and what things are protected, in the disabled space?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I know is a very big concern in lots of spaces, and I imagine this makes it exceptionally difficult too. We are nearing the end of the time for this conversation, but before we wrap up, I wanted to ask a couple of other things. One of which is, and this is a question for Adele and for Jess, mostly, I think, is about if in hearing about this, watching Maria's presentation and listening to this conversation, anyone feels inspired or motivated to try and do a project like this, given what we've spoken about disability dongles and the related issues, what are the best ways that you folks think people can approach this kind of question, particularly if they aren't actually a member of the communities that they're trying to solve problems for? Maybe Adele, do you have thoughts to start on that?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to sort of what Maria said in her talk, and just put yourself out there, get involved. I mean, particularly if we're talking about in the context of gaming, if I saw a character that could sign, I would lose my mind. It would be so exciting, and I'm sure that would be the same for most people. People are really keen to see themselves represented just across the board. And are really excited about it. So I'm sure you won't have any trouble finding someone to get involved.
Yeah, like with anything, the deaf community is a community. It is diverse. There are people who are going to be interested or uninterested in any particular project. For example, in the first round of recruitment for this project, some of the responses I got from deaf folks was, this is a dumb idea and why would I want this? But we've also had a lot of people who are really keen and see the potential for either themselves or members of their family and community to use the technology. As with any research, we have a little bit of participation bias because the people who are interested are the people who've signed up. But it's one of those things where you've just got to get out there, talk to the community, putting less about, this is the cool idea that I have, and more about, this is how I think it could help you, but I want to know if this is actually what you want. Do you have other ideas, better ideas? How should I be addressing this problem that I perceive? Tell me if this is valid. Very much being open to receiving the important feedback.
Yeah, for sure. Maria, is there anything else that you wanted to add on that point?
Well, I guess I'd like to remind everyone that we have social media now, and it's easier than ever to connect with any kind of community. So it's easier to find someone, and just joining a Facebook group and posting a message and explaining your idea might actually work. So I think it's a great start.
I would just say with that, joining community Facebook groups is a great way to go. It's definitely something I've done, but you always have to keep in mind, if you're not a member of the community, you are coming in as an outsider. So do approach with humility. do approach with an openness to the fact that you do not know what this community's needs and expectations are. You are coming in to ask a favor, which means that if you do have the funding to compensate the people that you're working with, this is also a very important and good and ethical thing to do, because it's not just, hi, let me exploit you and then sell you back something later. You want to work with them as equals and recognize that they are the experts, in the case of our project, not just in language, but also in the culture that we're trying to create a device for.
Thank you so much. As a final thing, I can see Ben is here. I wanted to ask each of you if there's any one last message that you would like to leave our audiences with, starting with Maria.
Yes, my last message is, I guess, if you're interested in creating sign-in avatars, there's actually research available. For example, there is a document, a design guidelines, containing design guidelines for designing sign-in avatars that contains data from interviews with deaf community. So you don't have to start from scratch. Just do some research, and there's actually already quite really good research available for this.
Thanks. Adele?
What I would leave you with is, I guess, a saying that is very common within the deaf and disabled community, and that is nothing about us without us.
Yep. Thank you. And Jess?
So Adele has stolen what I was intending to say, but it's essentially the same thing. Any community that you want to create something with and for, the only way to truly understand what they need and want in a technology is to ask them. And the more you can ask them, the more you can involve them, the better result you're going to have. And this is not just about disability. This is about any technology product. Working with your end users gives you better results and allows you to find problems and fix them sooner and more cheaply than waiting until the end and then figuring out, oh, actually, we've missed the mark.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I've actually made a page of notes myself here. Maria, Adele, Jessica, I assume you're going to be hanging around, answering questions for anyone who has them.
Sure.
Great.
Yes.
I will definitely say hi later.